The first time I saw my great-grandmother standing in the hallway after she died, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. For years, that's exactly what I wanted to believe. But every summer, when the air gets heavy and the cicadas start screaming after sunset, I remember that old house, the basement bedroom, and the sound of someone slowly trying my locked door in the middle of the night. I was 12 years old when my dad moved his family into my stepmom's grandmother's house. Back then, everyone blamed dementia. Looking back now, I don't think dementia had anything to do with it. My parents divorced when I was little, so every summer I'd spend nearly 2 months with my dad. By the early 2000s, he had remarried, and my stepmom, Melissa, had become one of my favorite people. She never tried to replace my mom. She never forced the whole I'm your new parent thing. She was just Melissa. We got along because we liked the same things, specifically horror movies. Every Friday, we'd rent whatever looked the creepiest at Blockbuster, make popcorn after my little half sister Emily went to bed, and laugh every time somebody in the movie made the dumb decision to investigate a strange noise. Melissa always had the same joke. Rule number one, she'd say, pointing at the television, if you hear something creepy, mind your own business. I'd grin. Then there wouldn't be a movie. She'd shrug. Exactly. That summer, though, life wasn't exactly normal. Melissa's grandmother, everyone just called her Grandma Eleanor, had reached the point where she couldn't safely live alone anymore. Her dementia had gotten bad, really bad. So instead of putting her into a nursing home, Dad and Melissa packed everything they owned into a moving truck and moved into Grandma Eleanor's old two-story house just outside a tiny farming town. Melissa refused to let her grandmother spend her last years with strangers. I grew up in that house, and she told me over the phone, weeks before school ended, I'm not letting her face this alone. There wasn't much room left once everyone moved in. Melissa took her old childhood bedroom again. Dad moved into the room with her. Emily's toddler bed fit in there too because she still liked sleeping near her parents. That left exactly 0 bedrooms, except the basement. It's actually pretty cool, Dad told me when he picked me up for the summer. You'll have your own space. I pictured a finished basement with carpet, maybe an old couch and a video game console. What I got was different. The basement looked like someone had started turning it into a bedroom 20 years earlier before giving up halfway through. Half the walls were covered in faded wood paneling. The rest were bare concrete. One corner had shelves packed with dusty mason jars, Christmas decorations, and boxes labeled in handwriting so faded I couldn't read it. There was an old twin bed with a squeaky metal frame, a dresser missing one drawer, a tiny CRT television sitting on a folding table, one lamp, one small window near the ceiling where I could see nothing except grass and the bottoms of people's shoes when they walked outside. The ceiling wasn't even finished. Wood beams stretched overhead with pipes running between them. Every time someone flushed a toilet upstairs, the pipes groaned like they were complaining. It isn't much, Melissa said apologetically. We tried to make it comfortable. Honestly, I loved it. At 12 years old, having my own basement felt like having my own apartment. Until bedtime. That first night, Dad walked downstairs carrying an old brass key. He handed it to me. Every night, he said, as you lock this door. He pointed toward the wooden basement door at the top of the stairs. I laughed. What am I going to do? Sleepwalk? He didn't smile. No. He looked toward the ceiling before lowering his voice. Your great-grandma wanders. Melissa sighed. It's part of the dementia. Dad nodded. If she finds the basement door unlocked, she might come down here thinking she lives downstairs. Okay. And if she knocks, he hesitated. Don't answer. Melissa quickly stepped in. Not because she's dangerous. She looked guilty even saying it. She just gets confused. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. Sometimes she forgets where she is. Sometimes she doesn't recognize us. Sometimes she thinks people are breaking into the house. Melissa quietly added, she especially hates open doors. I frowned. What do you mean? If she sees a bedroom door open while someone is sleeping? Melissa exchanged another glance with Dad. She panics. Dad finished the sentence. She'll drag you out of bed. I laughed again. Neither of them did. Melissa finally managed a weak smile. Just lock your door, okay? I always do. That became our nightly routine. Everyone said goodnight upstairs. Dad walked me to the basement. I'd lock the door. He'd jiggle the knob to make sure. Then, we'd each head to bed. It became so normal that after a couple of nights I stopped thinking about it. Until I met Grandma Eleanor. She was sitting in the living room one afternoon with 5 old porcelain dolls arranged perfectly across the couch. She wasn't talking to them. She was brushing their hair, slowly, patiently. Each doll wore tiny dresses that looked older than my dad. Melissa smiled. Grandma, this is Tyler. Grandma looked up. Her cloudy blue eyes landed on me. For a second, they looked completely normal. Oh, she smiled warmly. You're getting so big. Melissa blinked. You remember him? Grandma nodded. Of course I do. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Her skin felt like tissue paper. You still like dinosaurs? I laughed. Not really. Oh, she smiled. You're growing up. For almost an hour, she seemed perfectly fine. She told stories about Melissa getting into trouble as a kid. She laughed. She remembered birthdays. She remembered names. If I'd met her only then, I would have thought everyone had exaggerated the dementia. Then, without warning, she looked toward the front door. Her smile disappeared. Who left it open? Melissa looked over. The door was shut. No one did. Grandma stood. Someone left the door open. Her breathing became faster. They'll come inside. Melissa gently took her arm. It's closed, Grandma. Grandma yanked away. I said it's open. Her voice exploded through the house. Emily started crying upstairs. Dad hurried into the room. It's okay. Grandma shoved past him. She marched to the front door and checked the deadbolt 3 times, then checked it again, then stood there, staring through the peephole for nearly 5 minutes. Nobody said anything. Finally, Melissa whispered, It passes. Eventually, it did. Grandma walked back into the living room, sat down, picked up one of the dolls, and acted like nothing had happened. That night, Melissa apologized. I'm sorry you had to see that. I shrugged. It wasn't her fault. She smiled sadly. No, it wasn't. The first week passed without anything especially strange. Grandma wandered. She forgot names. Sometimes she'd ask where her husband was. He'd been dead for almost 15 years. Other times she'd introduce herself to Melissa as if they had never met. It was heartbreaking, but believable. Exactly what you'd expect from someone losing pieces of themselves. Then came the first night I had to leave the basement. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I looked at the basement door, locked, just like always. I grabbed the key off the nightstand, unlocked the door, and started upstairs. The house sounded completely different at night. Every floorboard creaked. The old grandfather clock ticked somewhere upstairs. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Moonlight spilled through the windows just enough to turn everything gray. After using the bathroom, I stopped by the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I heard it. Soft scraping. Wood against wood. Very slow. I assumed it was Grandma. The sound came from the dining room. Curiosity got the better of me. I peeked around the doorway. Grandma stood beside the dining table. She had every porcelain doll from the living room lined up along the edge. One by one, she turned each doll until they were all facing the hallway leading to the basement. She wasn't saying anything. She wasn't humming. She wasn't smiling. She just kept rotating them with careful little movements. Click, turn, click, turn, click. I swallowed. Grandma? Nothing. Grandma Eleanor? She froze. Slowly, very slowly. Her head turned toward me, not her body, just her head. Her eyes looked empty, like she didn't know who I was, or maybe didn't recognize me as a person at all. Then she blinked. Oh, she smiled. There you are. You should be asleep. I laughed nervously. I was getting water. She nodded once. Good. Then she looked back at the dolls. They have to watch the stairs. I frowned. What? She didn't answer. I stood there another few seconds before deciding I'd seen enough weirdness for one night. I carried my water downstairs, locked the basement door, got back into bed. I told myself she was confused. Nothing more. Just dementia. Just like everyone said. As I reached over to turn off my bedside lamp, I noticed something sitting on top of my dresser. One of the porcelain dolls. Its glass eyes were fixed directly on my bed. And I knew, with absolute certainty, it hadn't been there when I left the basement. I must have stared at that doll for a full minute before I finally convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I'd simply overlooked it. Maybe Melissa had brought it downstairs while I was asleep. Maybe Grandma had wandered into the basement earlier in the evening before I'd locked the door. At 12 years old, your mind will fight as hard as it can to keep the impossible from becoming real. So I picked the doll up, set it on the floor facing the wall, turned off the lamp, and crawled back into bed. I barely closed my eyes before I heard footsteps overhead. Slow, measured, not the uneven shuffle Grandma usually made. These sounded deliberate. 1, 2, 3. They crossed directly over my room, stopped, then continued toward the kitchen. I listened until they disappeared. The next morning, I carried the doll upstairs. Melissa frowned. "I've been looking for this." She took it from me. I thought Grandma hid it again. "You didn't bring it downstairs?" "No. I found it on my dresser." Melissa looked confused. "I didn't put it there." Dad overheard us while making coffee. "Grandma probably wandered down." The basement door was locked. He shrugged. "Then maybe before bed." It was enough of an explanation that nobody questioned it further, least of all me. The days stayed surprisingly normal. Grandma still had moments where she was completely herself. One afternoon, she sat on the porch with me while Melissa weeded the flower beds. She asked me about school, about baseball, about whether I still liked scary movies. She even laughed when I told her I'd finally beaten one of my video games. It was impossible to reconcile that sweet old woman with the one who screamed about open doors. Later that evening, Melissa found Grandma standing in the pantry. She had stacked every canned vegetable on the floor into perfect rows. When Melissa gently asked what she was doing, Grandma answered without looking up. "They're counting." Melissa smiled sadly. "What are they counting?" Grandma stopped moving. "The nights." She refused to say another word. After dinner that Friday, Melissa kept our tradition alive. Emily fell asleep upstairs, while Dad stayed in the living room watching baseball. Melissa carried popcorn into the family room. "I rented something special." She held up the VHS tape. "The others. I've heard it's good." "So have I." We watched with the lights off, whispering jokes every time one of the characters did something obviously stupid. At one point, I laughed. "If that was us, I'd already be outside." Melissa nudged me. "No. You'd be the curious kid who goes looking for the noise." "I would not." She raised an eyebrow. "You walked into the dining room the other night instead of going back downstairs." "Okay, maybe." She smiled. "I know you." When the movie ended, she stretched and looked toward the dark hallway. "Real houses aren't like horror movies." She said it casually, almost to reassure herself. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up thirsty. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, I unlocked the basement door and climbed the stairs with my flashlight. The hallway was empty. The kitchen was empty. I filled a glass from the sink. As I turned to head back downstairs, I heard whispering. Not words, just voices. Very quiet, coming from the living room. I clicked off the flashlight. Moonlight spilled through the front windows. Grandma sat in her rocking chair. Her back faced me. She wasn't rocking and she wasn't moving. She was simply sitting there, whispering. I couldn't make out what she was saying. It sounded like two people having a conversation. Only every sentence was spoken in Grandma's voice. She'd whisper, pause, then answer herself in a slightly different tone, back and forth, like someone else sat across from her. I took one careful step closer. The floor creaked. The whispering stopped instantly. Without turning around, Grandma said quietly, "You shouldn't interrupt." I froze. "I'm sorry." She remained perfectly still. "They don't like being interrupted." The hair on my arm stood up. "Who?" She slowly turned toward me. Her expression was completely blank. "What?" "You said they—" She frowned in genuine confusion. I didn't say anything. The next morning, she remembered none of it. Melissa apologized again. "It's getting worse." Dad nodded. "The doctor warned us." Grandma sat at the table smiling while buttering toast. She looked healthier than she had in days. Seeing her like that made me feel guilty for being scared of her. She wasn't trying to frighten anyone. She was sick. That's what I kept telling myself. A few nights later, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I woke to the sound of my basement doorknob rattling, not violently, just testing, back and forth. Metal softly clicking as someone trying to open it. I sat straight up. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then Grandma's voice drifted through the wood. Tyler? I swallowed. Yeah, you forgot. What? You forgot to leave it open. My heart pounded. Dad told me to lock it. A long pause. Then, no, he didn't. Her voice sounded oddly calm. He knows better. I stared at the door. She remained on the other side, not knocking and just waiting. Finally, she whispered home, Don't worry. I can wait. Her footsteps slowly faded up the stairs. I didn't sleep again that night. The following afternoon, I finally told Dad exactly what had happened. He rubbed his eyes. I'll start locking her bedroom. Melissa looked miserable. I hate doing that. We don't have a choice anymore. That night, they gently convinced Grandma to stay in her room. They even installed a small alarm on her bedroom door so they'd know if she wandered. For 3 nights, everything was quiet. No footsteps, no whispering, no rattling doorknob. I started relaxing. Then, on the 4th night, the alarm went off. I heard Dad rush across the hallway upstairs. Melissa followed. I climbed halfway up the basement stairs and listened. Dad called out, Grandma! No answer. Another door opened. Then Melissa gasped, She's gone! Everyone searched the house, every room, every closet. The front and back doors were still locked. Every window was latched. The police arrived within 20 minutes. They searched outside with flashlights while neighbors walked the property. Just after sunrise, they found Grandma. She was sitting peacefully in the backyard, in the middle of the flower garden, still wearing her nightgown, hands folded neatly in her lap. She smiled when Melissa reached her. I was waiting. For who? Grandma looked toward the house. The one downstairs. Melissa assumed she meant me. She smiled weakly. Tyler's asleep. Grandma slowly shook her head. No, the other one. From that day on, her decline came quickly. She stopped recognizing Melissa, stopped recognizing the house she'd lived in for decades. Sometimes she'd spend hours staring toward the basement door. Other times she'd cry because she insisted someone was trapped beneath the floor. The doctors adjusted her medications. Hospice nurses began visiting. The house became quieter. Not because things improved, because everyone was exhausted. One rainy afternoon, I found Melissa sitting alone at the kitchen table. She was crying. I just want my grandma back. I sat beside her. She smiled through tears. I know she's still here. She glanced toward the hallway, but sometimes it feels like she's already gone. I didn't know what to say, so I hugged her. She hugged me back. For a moment, the house felt normal again. Grandma passed away 6 days later, peacefully. Melissa held her hand until the very end. The funeral was small. Friends from church, old neighbors, family I'd never met. Everyone talked about how kind she had been, how generous, how funny. No one mentioned the screaming or the wandering or the dolls. Driving home from the cemetery, Dad finally said what everyone was thinking. She isn't suffering anymore. Melissa nodded quietly. And maybe... She looked back at the house as we pulled into the driveway. Maybe we'll all finally get some sleep. That evening, for the first time since I'd arrived for the summer, Dad didn't remind me to lock the basement door. None of us even thought about it. We were too emotionally drained. We said goodnight. I went downstairs, turned off the light, and fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the familiar sound of slow footsteps crossing the first floor. At first, I smiled. Dad must have gotten up for water. Then I heard him snoring through the ceiling. The footsteps continued. They stopped directly above my room. I waited for the pipes to creak, for the basement door to rattle. Instead, someone softly laughed. It was an old woman's laugh, the exact laugh Grandma used whenever Melissa told one of her childhood stories. The laughter drifted across the kitchen, down the hallway, until it stopped directly outside the basement door. A single finger traced slowly across the wood. Then came 3 gentle knocks. Not frantic, not confused, deliberate, patient, as if whoever stood on the other side already knew they no longer needed dementia as an excuse. The next morning, I didn't tell anyone about the knocking, not because I thought they'd laugh, because I knew exactly what they'd say. You're grieving. You dreamed it. The house is settling. I repeated those explanations to myself while I ate breakfast. Dad looked exhausted. Melissa barely touched her coffee. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward the empty rocking chair in the living room before remembering no one would be sitting there anymore. Emily asked where great-grandma had gone. Melissa forced a smile. She's with Grandpa now. Emily accepted that answer. I wished I could. The basement door stayed unlocked that day. Nobody mentioned it. It felt strange after weeks of treating it like the most important rule in the house. By afternoon, Melissa started gathering Grandma's belongings into cardboard boxes. I think it'll help, she said quietly. Dad nodded. We'll take it one room at a time. The first room they chose was the living room. I helped carry photo albums into the dining room while Melissa wrapped the porcelain dolls in newspaper. There were 12 of them. She handled each one carefully. I remember buying this one with Grandma. She smiled at a doll wearing a faded blue dress. I begged her for weeks. She wrapped another. This one sat in her bedroom my whole childhood. Another. This one scared me because its eyes followed you. She laughed softly. I guess every kid thinks that. By sunset, every doll had been packed away. Melissa sealed the final box with packing tape. There, she exhaled. I think that's enough for today. That night, we ordered pizza instead of cooking. Nobody felt like making dinner. Melissa even suggested watching a horror movie. Maybe we need something familiar? Dad gave her an uncertain look. Really? She shrugged. We've done it every Friday for years. So we watched one. None of us paid attention. Every little sound from the house pulled our eyes away from the television. Every creak, every groan, every settling board. When the credits rolled, Melissa turned the TV off. I think I'm just tired. She kissed Dad. Good night. Everyone went upstairs. I grabbed my flashlight before heading for the basement. Halfway down the stairs, I stopped. The basement light was already on. I knew I'd turned it off before dinner. I stood there listening. Nothing. Slowly, I continued downward. Everything looked normal. The bed and the dresser, the old television. Then I noticed something sitting neatly in the center of my pillow. One porcelain doll, blue dress, glass eyes. The exact doll Melissa had packed first. I stared at it until my legs started shaking. There was no way. I'd watched her wrap it. I'd watched her tape the box shut. Without touching the doll, I sprinted upstairs. Dad and Melissa were still awake. The words tumbled out so fast I barely made sense. The doll, it's downstairs. The blue one, you packed it. Dad frowned. What doll? Melissa's face drained of color. She hurried into the living room. The box of dolls still sat beside the fireplace. The tape hadn't been disturbed. She cut it open anyway. One by one, she counted them. 11. Dad looked inside. Weren't there 12? Neither of them said another word. Together we walked downstairs. The doll was gone. Only a faint square of dust remained where it had been sitting on my pillow. Dad searched every corner of the basement. Nothing. Melissa whispered to herself. I counted them. I know I counted them. She sounded less frightened than confused, like someone trying desperately to solve a math problem that refused to add up. That night, Dad locked the basement door again. Neither of us spoke about why. Over the next 3 days, the house changed. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of changes that make you question your own memory. Doors that were closed stood open. Cabinets we'd emptied were full again. A rocking chair gently swayed even when every window was shut. The smell of lavender drifted through empty rooms. Grandma had always smelled like lavender. Melissa noticed it first. She stood in the hallway one afternoon and closed her eyes. Do you smell that? Dad did, so did I. Emily simply smiled. It smells like Nana. Nobody answered her. The worst happened the following Friday. Around 2 in the morning, I woke needing the bathroom again. I unlocked the basement door, stepped into the hallway, and froze. The front door stood wide open. Warm summer air drifted inside. The screen door creaked softly against its frame. Immediately, I thought of Grandma, her panic whenever a door was left open. I hurried across the living room to close it. Just before I reached the handle, I noticed muddy footprints. Not coming in, going out, bare feet, small, old. They disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then I heard Melissa scream upstairs. Dad shouted her name. I ran up 2 steps at a time. Melissa stood in the hallway, staring toward the staircase. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, toward the first floor. Her voice barely worked. Did you, did you see her? Dad looked confused. Who? My grandma. Silence. I just watched her walk down the stairs. Dad gently took her shoulders. Melissa, I know what I saw. Tears streamed down her face. I know what my grandmother looked like. No one slept. The next morning, Dad called the hospice nurse who had cared for Grandma, not because she could explain ghosts, because he needed someone who understood grief. She listened patiently, then asked one question. Did Eleanor ever talk about the basement? Melissa shook her head. Never. The nurse frowned. That's strange. Why? Near the end. She kept asking us not to let anyone sleep downstairs. The room became completely still. Dad asked, Why? The nurse hesitated. She never explained. She'd just say, The woman looked toward the basement door. It knows children listen. That afternoon, Dad announced we were leaving. Not forever, just for a few days. A hotel? We all need sleep. Nobody argued. Packing took less than an hour. As Dad carried suitcases outside, I remembered I'd left my Game Boy on the basement dresser. I'll be right back. Melissa started to follow me. I'll come. I'll be 30 seconds. She reluctantly nodded. The basement felt colder than ever. I grabbed my Game Boy, turned toward the stairs. The basement door slowly swung shut. By itself, the latch clicked. I ran. The knob wouldn't turn. I pounded on the door. Dad! No answer. Then, behind me, came the soft scrape of porcelain against concrete. I turned. Every doll stood in a perfect line across the far wall. All 12, facing me, one by one, their heads tilted. Not all at once. One, then another, and then another. Until every pair of glass eyes met mine. A voice whispered behind me. Not Grandma's. Older. Lower. Patient. I've been waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut. The doorknob suddenly twisted. The door burst open. Dad grabbed me by the arm and pulled me into the stairwell. Melissa slammed the basement door. All three of us stumbled outside into the afternoon sunlight without saying a word. None of us looked back. Dad sold the house the following spring. He refused to tell the buyers why. Melissa couldn't bring herself to attend the closing. She never spoke about her grandmother's final weeks again. As for me, I stopped watching horror movies for a long time. Not because they frightened me, because they suddenly felt unrealistic. Real fear isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with monsters jumping out of closets. It waits. It lets you explain everything away. It wears familiar faces. It hides behind illnesses that make perfect sense. And when you finally convince yourself there was never anything to fear, it knocks. 3 slow knocks, patient. Certain, like it already knows you'll eventually have to open the door. I still lock my bedroom every night. Not because I'm afraid someone will come in, because once, when I was 12 years old, something waited on the other side of a basement door and taught me the difference between a sick old woman and whatever had been patiently waiting for her to leave.